Somewhere in nearly every man's life, there is a day that is supposed to feel like freedom. The last commute. The final meeting. The retirement party with cake in the break room and a card signed by people he worked alongside for decades. For years, this day was the goal. The finish line. The reward for everything that came before it. And yet, for a striking number of men, something unexpected happens in the months that follow. Not relief. Not the endless relaxation they pictured. Instead, a slow, confusing decline in energy, in mood, in physical health that seems to arrive from nowhere. Men who were sharp and capable at 64 suddenly seem noticeably older at 66. Not because of a diagnosis, not because of an accident, because of something far quieter and far more common than most people realize, retiring without a plan for what comes next. This video will walk through exactly what happens in the body and mind when structure disappears too quickly, why this effect is so often mistaken for ordinary aging, and, by the end, the specific, practical framework that allows men to retire without losing the very things that kept them sharp, strong, and engaged for decades. Stay through this, because the third factor covered here is the one almost no one expects. And it explains why some retired men seem to get younger while others seem to age in fast motion. The retirement cliff. Nobody warns you about for most of adult life. A man's days are shaped by external structure. A schedule to follow, problems to solve, people depending on him, deadlines that create urgency, and small wins that create satisfaction. This structure is so constant that most men never notice it is doing anything for them at all. The way a person never notices. The floor beneath their feet until it is suddenly gone. Retirement removes that structure almost overnight. One day, a man is solving problems, coordinating with colleagues, and moving through a day built around purpose. The next day, that entire framework is gone, and nothing has automatically replaced it. Researchers who study aging and retirement transitions have observed that this abrupt loss of structure, not the absence of work itself, but the absence of anything meaningful replacing it, is strongly associated with declines in physical activity, mood, and cognitive engagement in the years immediately following retirement. The body and mind, it turns out, do not respond well to a sudden vacuum. They respond to direction. This is the retirement cliff, the gap between the structured life a man leaves behind and the unstructured life he steps into, with nothing yet built to bridge the two. What actually happens when structure disappears? Physical activity quietly collapses. It seems counterintuitive. Retirement should mean more free time, and free time should mean more movement. In practice, the opposite often happens. Without a commute, without walking between meetings, without the small physical demands built into a working day, total daily movement frequently drops, sometimes substantially, in the months following retirement. This decline tends to be gradual and easy to miss because it does not feel like a decision. Nobody consciously chooses to move less. The structure that used to generate movement simply isn't there anymore, and without a deliberate replacement, the body settles into a quieter, more sedentary rhythm by default. Over time, this contributes to the same patterns of muscle loss, reduced cardiovascular capacity, and slower metabolism associated with a less active lifestyle at any age. 2. Cognitive engagement drops. Along with it, a career, whatever its form, typically demands ongoing problem-solving, decisions, coordination, adaptation to new situations. This kind of regular cognitive demand is a form of mental exercise, and like physical exercise, it tends to maintain sharpness through consistent use. When that demand disappears without a replacement, cognitive engagement can decline in a similar way. This does not mean cognitive decline is inevitable in retirement. Far from it. But research on cognitive aging consistently points to sustained mental engagement, novelty, and problem-solving as protective factors, and a retirement spent primarily on passive activities without much new challenge or learning. Removes a layer of protection that was previously built into daily working life without anyone having to think about it. 3. The overlooked factor. Loss of identity and social role. This is the piece almost nobody talks about, and it may be the most powerful of the three. For most of adult life, a man's sense of identity is deeply tied to his role. Provider, problem solver, expert, mentor, the person others rely on. Retirement does not just remove a job. For many men, it quietly removes a core piece of how they have understood themselves for decades. This loss of role often comes bundled with a loss of social contact. Workplace relationships, the casual conversations, the shared projects, the sense of being part of something, frequently fade quickly once daily interaction ends. And social connection is one of the most consistently studied protective factors in aging research, closely linked to both cognitive health and overall physical well-being. When it disappears alongside a loss of role and purpose, the combined effect tends to be far greater than either factor alone. This is why some men describe retirement not as freedom, but as a kind of quiet disappearance, not from the world exactly, but from the version of themselves they had built and relied on for so long. Why this gets mistaken for ordinary aging? Here is the pattern that makes this so easy to misread. A man retires. Over the following 1 to 2 years, he becomes less active, less mentally engaged, and less socially connected. 3 changes that happen gradually enough that no single day feels like a turning point. By the time family members or the man himself notices something has shifted, it looks exactly like the natural, expected effects of getting older. But the timing tells a different story. These changes cluster tightly around the retirement transition itself, not around any particular age. A man who retires at 58 often shows this same pattern earlier than a man who continues working, staying mentally and physically engaged into his 70s. Age is a factor, but the structural shift of retirement, and specifically an unplanned, unstructured version of it, appears to be a far stronger driver of this particular kind of decline than the number of birthdays involved. This distinction matters enormously because it changes the entire framing. This is not simply something that happens to a man as he gets older. It is something that happens when structure, purpose, and connection are removed all at once, without anything built to take their place. And that means it is something a man has real influence over, building a retirement that protects rather than erodes. The goal is not to avoid retirement or to keep working out of fear. It is to approach the transition the same way a person would approach any major life shift, deliberately, with a plan, rather than assuming that free time alone will naturally fill itself with meaning. Replace structure before it disappears. The most effective approach is to build a new framework. Days with some predictable shape, whether that involves a project, a volunteer commitment, part-time work, or a regular schedule of physical activity, before the old structure is gone, rather than waiting to feel lost and reacting afterward. Choose activities with genuine engagement, not just occupation. Watching television or scrolling through a phone fills time, but it does not replace the mental demand that a career once provided. Activities that involve learning, problem solving, or skill development, a new hobby, a course, managing a real project offer far more protective value than passive time filling. Prioritize consistent physical movement as a non-negotiable. Because daily activity no longer happens automatically, it needs to be deliberately built into the schedule, the same way a meeting would have been. Regular walks, strength training, sports, or any consistent movement practice directly counter the sedentary drift that tends to follow retirement. Actively rebuild social connection. Since workplace relationships often fade quickly, new sources of regular social contact, community groups, clubs, regular time with friends and family, volunteer teams need to be intentionally built rather than assumed to happen naturally. Connection that requires effort to maintain tends to fade. Connection that is scheduled and prioritized tends to last. Men who approach retirement this way, treating it as a transition to be planned rather than an ending to be endured, consistently report not just better mood, but measurably better physical health outcomes in the years that follow, compared to men who retire without a clear plan for what comes next. The real takeaway retirement itself is not the danger. An empty calendar is. The men who seem to age in fast motion after leaving work are rarely victims of an unavoidable biological process. They are often men who lost structure, engagement, and connection all at once, with nothing built to replace any of it. And the men who seem to grow sharper, stronger, and more energized well into their 70s and beyond are usually not genetically fortunate. They are men who understood, often without ever putting it into words, that a life needs direction at every stage, not just during the decades spent working, but especially in the years that follow. This video is intended for general educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice. Anyone experiencing persistent low mood, significant changes in physical health, or difficulty adjusting to major life transitions should speak with a qualified healthcare provider. Retirement was never meant to be an ending. It was meant to be a change in direction. The men who treat it that way tend to keep moving, and the ones who keep moving tend to keep aging well.